my pleasure to introduce the moderator for our next panel, which deals with foreign direct investment. It's Professor J Kobrin from the Wharton School. He's the executive director of the Wharton Digital Press. And he's probably the person in the room who knows the most about foreign direct investment after decades of doing research on risk and how multinationals make decisions. And actually, prior to becoming an academic, he also had a short career as an executive in Latin America, of all places. So please welcome J Kobrin.
Thank you. Let me start with a short commercial. Wharton Digital Press and Knowledge of Wharton are publishing a book on the 28th of April, The Road to Cuba, Opportunities and Risks for U.S. Business. We're happy to give everyone at the conference an early volume, an early copy. You'll get an email next week, just after the Easter holiday. It'll tell you the website to go to and give you a code. The ebook is device and platform agnostic. So whatever you read ebooks on, whether it's a device or your computer, you can read the book on that, and we hope you enjoy it. Now let's turn to the panel. The BBC has been doing a series on Cuba over the last week or two. And last week I heard a BBC reporter with a little bit of the typical BBC arrogance interviewing 3 young girls outside of college in Cuba. And he asked them, or really said to them, you really don't want American capitalism here, do you? You don't want a Burger King and a McDonald's on every corner. And the answer from one of the girls is, we want the Burger King. All the girls want to shop. And unfortunately, demand for a Burger King or McDonald's doesn't immediately translate into a positive climate for foreign direct investment. There's a lot of questions about the market, about US policy, about Cuban policy, and about the interaction between them that are critical. And fortunately, we have 3 very well-qualified panelists to help us deal with the issue. I've asked them each to speak for a few minutes. Then we'll have some questions among the panelists, and then open the floor to all of you. I'm sure you have lots of questions. Phil Peters, who's on my far left, is president of the Cuba Research Center. He's written widely on Cuba and Cuban issues. Gustavo Membiela, who is on my immediate left as a partner in Hunton Williams. I'm very pleased to say he is a graduate of the Penn Law School and was also selected as one of the under 40 for service in the Miami-Dade area. And Mark Entwistle, who is in the middle, was a Canadian ambassador to Cuba from '93 to '97. He also had assignments in Tel Aviv and Moscow and is now founding partner in Acasta Capital. Phil, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor. Thanks to all of you, and thanks to the sponsors. I'm delighted to join you. And I thought that I could start out this panel about foreign investment by talking about the change that's taking place in Cuba and how profound it is and where foreign investment fits into that. In the early years of the revolution, the very beginning of the revolution, they got rid of all the foreign investors, and it was part of their achievement, as they saw it, of full sovereignty, and in that case, full economic sovereignty. In 1968, there were 80,000 remaining small businesses, and there was a great revolutionary offensive, as they called it, and they wiped out the remaining small businesses because they were viewed as unnecessary to the socialist project, all of them. In 1986, there was another ideological campaign, the most distinguishing feature of which was to end an experiment in free market sales of agricultural produce, so that it was reconcentrated in the hands of the state, so that the state was in charge of getting the produce from the farms and bringing it to the consumers, and that it wasn't any need for any private sector, market-based intermediaries. Now, all of those decisions have gone out the window. 3 major points in the economic history of socialist Cuba, those decisions have been reversed. And it's a really important thing to note. The man in charge now, President Raul Castro, is quite different than his brother, and he's putting the country on a path that his Orthodox brother would never have chosen. He has made a diagnosis. He's a very blunt guy and actually very businesslike in many ways, I think. He's made a diagnosis that what they have is not sustainable and that they need to change, and he said very bluntly that either we fix this or we will go under. the decisions that they've made, opening up to foreign investment, they've got a new investment law, and they are trying to bring in a lot more foreign investment to make this, the economy more prosperous. They have liberated to a degree in the agriculture sector. They're reducing the size of the state intermediary and every day increasing the amount of production that is being handled by the market. So farmers are selling directly to consumers. And as my friend Ted Henkin described this morning, probably the most visible change they've made is to allow entrepreneurship at a much larger scale, so that the number of private entrepreneurs has gone since 2010 from about 3% of the labor force to about 11% of the labor force. These are serious changes. They're based on principles that the president, that the party, that the system has enunciated, that the government is too big, that the economy overall needs to be more productive, that more government projects is not the way, that they need a bigger private sector, that they need foreign investment to drive production forward, and they need a lot of it. And they also need to re-engineer their social guarantees. They're not giving up on their commitments to free health care, free education, and all that, but they need to re-engineer all that so that they're providing assistance to people who need it, as opposed to providing universal benefits to people regardless of income. These are big changes. Now, and I don't think it's debatable at all how big they are ideologically or in terms of the daily lives of Cubans. If you think about all these changes and you think about what the issues people confront around their kitchen table, it's really sort of changing the social contract in a lot of ways. Can I prosper if I start a new business? If I've had this government job that has taken care of me after a fashion for so many years, will I still have it? In this new economy, what should I get my education in? Et cetera. So I don't think the magnitude of the change is debatable. It's certainly debatable how well they're doing. It's debatable how fast they're going, and a lot of us would probably prescribe something faster. A lot of Cubans would like more, deeper changes and for them to occur faster. And it's certainly debatable whether the results are going to allow them to hit their targets. But the changes are real. Foreign investment is one of the incomplete parts of it. The pace of all these changes is kind of slow, and I think we sneer at that, but of course we're the greatest democracy in the world, and our Congress often can't pass a budget without closing down our entire government, so I don't think we should be too smug about that. But nonetheless, they're moving slowly. With the foreign investment law published last year, they've published a list of opportunities, and it's moving through the bureaucracy, and they're involved in the courtship of foreign investors. Whether they get to the goals that they've set of bringing in $2 to $2.5 billion per year in capital, that's pretty ambitious. If you consider the big wave of foreign investment they had in the 1990s, right after the Soviet Union collapsed, they brought in, $4 or $5 billion in capital in the course of that decade. Now they want to bring in every year half of what they brought in the course of all the 1990s. Very ambitious. But they're starting to get there, and I think that they may not hit that target, but I think that they will, and the opportunities are as broad as the Cuban economy. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Phil. Ambassador, floor.
Thank you very much, Professor. I will just segue a little bit from Phil's note and agree, actually, that I think we have Cuba before us that is a country and a society that is evolving. It's a country that's moving. I think even political opposition to the current government sense and feel that there's a fluidity in Cuba now. I don't really think, frankly, most of the Cubans really know where exactly they're going or where they're going to end up. But there's a lot of balls in the air now, a lot of factors all interrelated. The president of Cuba, if the electoral reforms go through, will step down in 2018, I guess. This is incomprehensible, even literally last year, to have a Cuba without a Castro as president. We'll see how all that unfolds, but this is fundamental, kind of fundamental stuff that's going on. I think Cuba is very easy to caricature. I would urge you not to caricature it. It's a highly nuanced country. Cuba in 2015 is not the Cuba of the 1950s, of course. It's a much more mature country. It's more independent. Also, it's a complex country. I think the Cuban economy is actually, when we talk about it, there in fact are multiple economies all existing simultaneously. As I sometimes say, and for anybody who's heard this before, my apologies, but I think there's probably 4 economies of fundamental interest, certainly the way I see it. There is actually, we're a bit obsessed outside Cuba with this idea of the Cuban private sector, el sector privado, because it's been loaded up, and it's very, very important what's going on with the cuentapropistas, et cetera. Very important, without question, and it's taking a lot of releasing a lot of steam in the economy and in society. Its origins, of course, are the state pushing people into this, bear in mind, because it wanted to lay off 1.5 million Cubans from the state payroll because it couldn't afford it anymore. And they wanted the state out of certain areas. So the state itself, in a funny way, is pushing people towards 2 sectors. This cuentapropista sector, which we tend to call the entrepreneurs, etc. But that's what they are. There's another very interesting sector I urge you to watch and follow, which is the formation of urban cooperatives, drawing on the agricultural experience. These are in a very Cuban way, Cuban mechanics. Really what are effectively, in many ways, a quasi-privatization of state enterprises appearing right before our eyes. And Cuban economists predict there could be 1,000 of these created this year. These are really almost management buyouts of Cuban state companies in a number of different sectors. The regulatory frameworks around the cooperatives hasn't even caught up with where they are in the economy and the society, but it's something to watch. But of course, and there is a tiny little true in a way private sector, which most people don't realize. Mostly in the agricultural sector, there are private farmers, mostly in tobacco. But if you look at a map of landholding in Cuba, you have all these little private farmers, especially in Pinar del Rio and in provinces like that. And then you've got the big, huge state sector, which for the foreseeable future, and all aspirations of something else aside, so talking about the Cuba that we have before us. It's the state sector that most U.S. business will deal with, all foreigners deal with, and that's the main sector. The general attitude, I think, of Cuba towards direct foreign investment is probably summed up. If they could do it all themselves, they would. And I think it's informed. You have to have pretty profound knowledge, I think, of their history to understand the strong currents of economic nationalism in the way the Cubans view things. They have, however, and Phil is right about this, realized that, of course, they can't do everything themselves. There are certain strategic sectors. There's access to the global capital markets they can't do themselves. So they are, open for business, I would say, on the foreign investment side. I think in very recent history, there's been probably, I think, 3 phases we've watched them go through, and I've kind of lived them all because I've been in Cuba for quite a while. After the fall of the Soviet Union and the Cuban economy precipitously collapsed, probably lost 2/3 of its GDP, even 3/4, 80%, let's say. There's different estimates. There was a Wild West time in roughly 1993, I would say, till maybe the end of the 90s. It was crazy town. The Cubans weren't quite sure where to go. They were experimenting with all kinds of stuff. All kinds of foreign business came in at that time. No Americans, of course. Europeans, Mexicans, Canadians, Chileans, Israelis flooded the place. They formed all these joint ventures in every imaginable field you could count on. Turned out that not all foreign business were created equal. A lot of those businesses didn't work for the Cubans. They learned powerful lessons in the 1990s. Diligence, know your partner. Then we had very roughly a second phase in the 2000s of a reaction to that. They cleaned out a lot of these joint ventures for non-performance. Not all on the Cuban side, lots of it by foreign non-performance, by the way, mom and pop shops that couldn't deliver. And then after the new foreign investment law, I would say from March of last year, you've got, I think, a renewal of interest and access to the global capital markets. I'm happy to talk about how it all works in real practical ways, how the process of how these deals get done, if anybody's interested in that. And I'll finish off so we can get to questions. If I had one sort of conclusion I've reached after this time dealing with the Cubans in so many ways. And my advice would be, unsolicited, but maybe solicited since you're here, really listen to what they tell us. They're hard, tough negotiators, but they're very explicit, they're very clear-minded, they have their own economic development priorities. It won't be necessarily what we all want to do. Lots of U.S. business won't be able to do any business in Cuba because the Cubans don't want to do it. And so they tell you point blank what they're interested in. And if you're in a business they're interested in, then the opportunity's there. Thanks, Steve.
Thank you. Gustavo?
Thanks, Professor. So I agree with what both panelists have said, that the Cuba is really in transition. And I think one of the things we've heard here earlier today was what the willingness of the Cubans were, to actually do business going forward. And I think that you can see that in the laws, in the new investment laws. Starting in 2010, there's been a series of changes in the laws that have occurred in Cuba. In 2013, you had the creation of the Membiela zone. In 2014, you have a new investment law. And I think to Mark's point on listening to the Cubans, in November of last year, they put out a menu of basically different projects that they're looking for foreign direct investment on. So that to me signals a real desire on the part of the Cubans to take on this type of foreign direct investment. Now, when you're looking at the new investment law, there's basically three, and as a lawyer, this is sort of what I look at, is there's basically three types of vehicles that the new investment law allows you to take in entering into the country. One of them is basically a commercial contract with the Cuban entity. The second one, which has historically been the most popular structure for investments, has been the joint venture with a Cuban partner, and you can also form a company which is purely constituted with foreign capital. So you have these three types of different entities, and when we look at this, we look at them as trying to see the best ways which you control the risk. And as you take on, as you go into the different structures, there are going to be different advantages and disadvantages to you in doing business in the country. The other thing I wanted to touch on, just because it's part of what I do and sort of, I think, something that's on a lot of people's mind when you talk about Cuba is sort of expropriation risk. And in the new investment law, expropriation is protected. There are carve-outs for reasons why the country, the government could expropriate the property. I don't think they're that different than the expropriation rationale in any other country. Obviously, the devil's in the details and in how it's applied, down the road. But the other thing that in doing foreign direct investment, a lot of companies look at is the existence of multilateral treaties, which can protect your investment depending on where you're incorporated. And Cuba has multilateral treaties with 71 different countries, which are designed to protect foreign direct investments into the country.
Thank you. Let me ask each of you one question, and then let's move on to the audience. People have lots of them. Let me start with Mark. Investors tend to be able to deal with almost any environment if it's predictable and stable. With an autocracy, with a democracy, as long as they can figure out where they're going in the future. Is the Cuban environment, regardless of its rule, going to be stable into the future and predictable? Or are we going to see dramatic swings that are going to catch people on the way?
Well, at the end of the day, it's always a little bit of a crystal ball about the future. But my gut, and this is my vote for the stability question. And I think a part of my answer is around the relative stability of Cuba vis-a-vis the rest of the world. There's a university in Canada that does a global kind of political stability list, where they have multiple criteria for political and economic stability, and Cuba fits right smack in the middle. It's about the 50th percentile. There's a whole whack of countries that certainly these academics perceive as much less quote-unquote stable, which are a list filled with the countries we deal with commercially on a daily basis, and are normal everyday trading partners for us all. The possibility of for example, dramatic political change in Cuba, I guess, is always possible. I personally believe, you've got 60 years of, there's something in the relationship between the state and the people that is underestimated outside Cuba. It's very nuanced. I think Phil mentioned social contract. I believe that part of the legitimacy of the Cuban state clearly does not derive from multi-party democratic elections, but there is a political or a broad social contract between the Cuban people and the state.
How about stability of the investment climate? Not the regime itself.
Oh, stability.
Are the rules likely to change quickly?
I think, I think fundamentally foreign investors, from my experience, you're always going to find, cases that didn't work out well. Fundamentally, if you have I will say, medium to term strategic vision for the country, you're not in it for a quick buck to exit and enter. You understand what you're going to do. It is, in fact, a very stable environment. There are twists and turns. There are some currency controls from time to time. The Cubans usually come right back and pay them. They have liquidity management issues. They do all that kind of stuff. Their bureaucracy is really probably the issue, but the stability of the process in reaching economic agreements is not the issue in Cuba.
Phil, let me ask you a question. What are the 2 or 3 things you would like to see happen to make the investment in the climate for foreign direct investment in Cuba attractive, or more attractive than it is now? What needs to happen in the foreseeable future?
I mean, first of all, the United States should take Cuba off the list of state sponsors of terrorism. First of all, because it's a ridiculous accusation that discredits us, that devalues our word in discussions of terrorism around the world, and is not supported by any evidence. So that's the most important reason for us to do it. It would carry with it, though, an end to financial sanctions that we impose on the Cuban economy, where we go after all their international financial transactions. And so with the disappearance of those financial sanctions, the investment climate would improve because their access to capital would increase, the cost of the rates of interest that they pay would decrease. They would be able to deal with the international financial system normally, as opposed to a small subset of international banks that have a very, very high tolerance for risk and hassle. On the Cuban side, I would mention first that they need to get on with fixing their currency, because whether you're a foreign investor or whether you're a Cuban national in any line of work, you're operating in a 2-currency system. It bifurcates the entire economy. It makes purchasing. It means you don't have a price system. They don't have a single. They need to unify their currency and hopefully make it a freely convertible currency. That would very much improve the investment climate. Foreign investors, and in fact many Cubans, also say that they need to, and I agree with this, they need to allow direct hiring of workers. I'm confident that they can address their social protection concerns in a system where they allow joint ventures to hire workers directly. That's a big obstacle. It's been debated in the Cuban media. If you read the Cuban media, even though the law came out and maintains the system where foreign investors hire through Cuban employment agencies, there's plenty of debate about it, and I hope, and I do think they'll get around to it.
Gustavo, let me ask you a question about the rule of law. We're talking at lunch that one of the advantages Cubans have is they can watch any television show anytime because they're simply copied and reproduced on disk drives and distributed widely. What about protection of intellectual property rights, contract law? Is that going to change? Is it going to protect investors?
There are protections built into the Cuban laws for the protection of intellectual property rights, and I think those are things that we'll have to see as it goes along. Like I said, how they actually are implemented, and the level of protection that are given to intellectual properties. But and everyone that I've spoken to, the Cuban lawyers and whatever, they maintain that there is a rule of law system, and that they want to abide by these laws that they've passed, and And all indications are from some of the international arbitrations and other proceedings that they've been involved with commercially that there is a further willingness to follow the rule of law.
Well, let me put you on the spot. Would you advise a client that the protection of intellectual property of contracts of property in Cuba is sufficient to make an investment? And you don't have to answer that.
I think it's a risk reward thing ultimately for the client, and you have to look at what your reward is going to be. Moving into any sort of emerging market, you're going to have problems. Protection. It's not something that's particular to Cuba in terms of protecting of your intellectual property rights. And with like moving into any other emerging market, you have to evaluate whether you're going to ever be able to enforce them or not.
Thank you. Let's open the floor to questions. Please, is there a microphone? Or I can just be louder. I think it's better to be microphoned, amplified.
Hi. So my question has to do with my ability to get redress in cases where contracts aren't honored, anywhere from a one-to-one basis with maybe an employee all the way to perhaps a contract with the state. Who can I sue? What's the transparency there? How confident can I be that I'm going to get my redress if I were to prevail on something like that?
Well, the new Cuban investment law allows for you, when you answer that question is where can I sue, under what law can I sue, and the new Cuban investment law allows for the negotiation in terms of arbitration as a possible forum where you don't have to go to the Cuban legal system for redress, other than in instances of dissolution of the joint venture. So, and then that would be governed by the Articles of Association, and then that would go to the Cuban legal system. It also provides for choice of law provisions, where you can pick the law of a neutral company, so of a neutral country. So you could, for example, pick Spanish law going into Cuba as your choice as your chosen law. Of course, it's all subject to negotiation, and if you're negotiating with the government, it's not so clear as what their willingness is going to be to ultimately do that.
If just a very, very concrete example just on that, and it is all negotiated at the end of the day, just the arbitration provisions of a joint venture agreement, which shall go nameless, of which I was party, quite recent, so it's fairly recent thinking. The way arbitration's treated, for example, you go through all kinds of internal kumbaya stuff to see if you can, reach it out. But by the time it gets to arbitration, they were using the arbitration tribunals of the International Chamber of Commerce in Paris, a tribunal with 3 justices, 1 Cuban, 1 foreign, and one elected by the 2 of them together. And I'm not a lawyer, but there's a Washington Treaty of 1952 or something on arbitration, which is applicable and applies. And that's just to give you a sense of how, a concrete example of how arbitration was dealt with.
And to that point, they're also signatories to the New York Convention on the Enforcement of Foreign Arbitrable Awards, which is the same convention that all the other countries are parties to, that you can then try and domesticate your award and enforce it.
In the back?
You spoke about the fixing the dual currency system. Any insight into the timing and the potential impact of that?
No. I mean, they've taken, it's on the docket. It's coming soon, they say, but and they've taken some initial steps in applying different exchange rates in a few selected parts of the economy. But in terms of really biting the bullet, no, and it's quite a big step, and it's the kind of adjustment that most countries have undertaken, adjustments of that size and of that potential social impact. They've done that with external support. Of course, the World Bank, the IMF, none of them are in there providing support to Cuba to do that. So you can understand why they're taking some time, but they're not there yet.
Both to address a question that came back here about tax regime, and since you didn't talk about tax regime at all under the new joint venture law, the foreign investment law, it might be worth just commenting on that, because it's actually pretty positive, right, from a joint venture setup. Because the comment, I think, was confused to someone back here, may have been more broadly, is that the very punitive tax regime, which I referred to for the cuentapropistas, 40% maximum deductibility and all that applies to cuentapropistas, does not apply to foreign direct investment under the new law. It's actually much better for foreign direct investments. I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Yeah, and then there's a special tax regime also in Membiela that's favorable too.
In fact, John, that was, I would say, one of the principal characteristics of the new Foreign Investment Law 118 was the fundamental difference between that and the old one is around the tax treatment issues. And I think it was also important in the reaffirmation of the interest in foreign investment and return to the capital markets. But it was the tax treatment piece that's the key.
And the new rates are being applied to existing joint ventures. So those that are there now got a tax cut.
You mentioned that there were probably 71 bilateral agreements with Cuba and other countries. Are there any of those that are favored over the others? One of the pieces of information we got was that certain countries, Spain as an example, has an advantageous bilateral agreement that offers more protection against expropriation and other things like that. Can you comment on that at all?
I'll be very honest with you. I have not reviewed all 71 treaties, but you know, if you want to hire us, we'll be more than happy to do a study for you. Very good. So.
Well, broadly speaking, do you anticipate or do you see broad differences between those bilateral agreements? Are they typically pretty similar?
Do you want to go ahead?
I have not reviewed them all either, clearly, but knowing how the Cubans are, I would suspect they're all very similar. Yeah. Because they're extremely juridical and legalistic the way they go about these, especially international agreements. They're probably very similar, if not identical, almost.
Yeah, and most of those agreements usually have, you know, most favored nation provisions where if somebody gets a better, you know, better treatment in another treaty, it, you know, it gets carved into the treaty that you have.
Okay. Let me close with one last question to the panelists. We've just got the 5-minute warning, so let's be brief if we can. A real question, why should I go into Cuba? It's an island of 11 million people. It's not a huge market. As a foreign investor, what's there to attract me? Is there a labor force, technological capabilities, natural resources? I know beaches and 11 World Heritage Sites for tourism, but what else? I mean, we're talking about foreign investment as a reason to go in.
Well, no one should go in for any reason other than commercial reasons. I mean,
but what are they?
Companies are not political science projects, so they should go in for commercial reasons. But those that consider going in for commercial reasons, some will find advantages, that they've got a highly competent and educated workforce, that there are a lot of opportunities in many sectors, people in the biotechnology and medical sector, whether it's anything from medical services to the development of medicines, have opportunities there. There's a lot of talent in the software area that some companies would be very interested in. They need to do a lot to develop telecommunications, and hopefully the changes that President Obama made are going to result in some deals that provide both profits and a lot of benefit to the Cuban public. They're in great need now of expanding their hotel capacity, and as anyone knows, and as Mr. Del Rio mentioned this morning, it's a very interesting destination, and it's taking off. They're bursting at the seams now, so they need to go through what they did in the early 90s, which is a big expansion of hotel capacity. So there's a set of opportunities.
Mark, do you have anything?
All of that. I must admit, I left a very cushy diplomatic job to jump off the end of a dock to go into the private sector because of the Cuba opportunity. So as I saw it, a perfect storm of all kinds of ingredients for a probably highly undervalued economy, which we don't have much in the world anymore. Everything that Phil said, plus agriculture, plus raw minerals, raw materials. The reason Sherritt's there is there's one of the world's largest nickel cobalt reserves in the world. And lastly, I'm very interested in the knowledge-based economy, which when they developed IT and biotech pharma as key pillars, was one of their visions for Cuba in the future that would not be relying on monoculture sugar and other basic industries, and would in fact be a knowledge economy of the future, which is kind of exciting, and they're very smart.
Gustavo?
I agree with everything they said.
Well, please join me in thanking the panelists for a really informative session.
Thank you.